Have you ever wondered why, despite millennia of social structures designed to favor men, we are now witnessing an extraordinary rise of women in practically every field of human activity? It's not a coincidence, and it's not just social justice finally manifesting itself. There's something much deeper happening, something rooted in human evolutionary biology itself, which is only now, under the specific conditions of the 21st century, finding the perfect environment to flourish. This is one of those rare moments when seemingly unrelated changes in technology, economy, culture, and biology converge to create a perfect storm of transformation. And at the center of that storm, quietly, but with remarkable force, a new balance of power between the genders is emerging, one that few foresaw and even fewer fully understand. For millennia, human societies have been shaped predominantly by traits that favored certain masculine characteristics: physical strength, aggressiveness, direct competition, rigid hierarchies, not because these traits were inherently superior or more valuable, but because the material conditions of human existence made them extraordinarily useful. In a world of scarcity, where survival depended on the ability to hunt, fight, and dominate territories and resources, these characteristics offered clear adaptive advantages. And so, gradually, we built entire civilizations around these values, social structures that rewarded them, and educational systems that cultivated them. But it turns out we are living in a unique moment in human evolutionary history. For the first time, we are creating an environment radically different from the one in which we evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, an environment where physical strength rarely matters, where collaboration often outperforms pure competition, where emotional intelligence and complex communication are more valuable than aggression, where flexible networks demonstrate more resilience than rigid hierarchies. And here's the unexpected twist. Women, on average, don't need to adapt to this new environment. In many crucial ways, they are already pre-adapted to it. To understand this transformation, we need to go far back into our evolutionary history. About 7 million years ago, our ancestors began to diverge from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees. Over the following millions of years, several hominid species emerged and disappeared, each exploring slightly different ecological niches. Our direct ancestors, the first members of the genus Homo, appeared about 2.5 million years ago, marking the beginning of an evolutionary trajectory that would eventually lead to Homo sapiens. One of the most significant developments in this trajectory was the progressive increase in human brain size. Our brains are exceptionally large for our body size, consuming approximately 20% of our resting energy, despite representing only about 2% of our body mass. This extraordinary, energetic investment in cognitive capacity shaped virtually every aspect of our biology and behavior. But this development created a particularly challenging evolutionary dilemma for human females. The larger the brain, the larger the infant's skull, making childbirth increasingly dangerous. At the same time, human babies had to be born relatively premature compared to other primates with brains still far from fully developed in order to pass through the birth canal. That meant human infants required intensive and prolonged care, creating unprecedented demands on mothers. As a result, human females faced extraordinary selective pressures to develop skills that allowed them to successfully navigate this new and complex social terrain. They needed to read emotional subtleties, build cooperative alliances, communicate complex needs, negotiate support from others, anticipate dangers to vulnerable children, and maintain social cohesion in extended groups. In other words, they faced intense evolutionary pressure to develop precisely the skills that the 21st century world now values most. Consider what's happening on the global stage today. We're witnessing a fundamental transformation in the nature of work and power. Advanced economies depend less and less on brute strength and increasingly on emotional intelligence, effective communication, teamwork, continuous learning, and adaptability. The information revolution rewards those who can process, synthesize, and communicate complex knowledge. Globalization values the ability to navigate different cultural contexts and build bridges between diverse perspectives. Advances in automation are gradually eliminating jobs that rely solely on mechanical repetition, while amplifying the value of distinctly human qualities like empathy, creativity, and systems thinking. In virtually every high-value economic domain, we see the decline in importance of physical attributes and the rise of social and cognitive competencies. This is not an essentialist argument. I'm not suggesting that all women naturally possess these skills or that all men lack them. Individual variation always surpasses group averages. What I'm highlighting is a change in the environment that fundamentally alters which sets of skills confer adaptive advantage. And the change is creating an unprecedented alignment between certain adaptations that were more strongly selected in human females and the demands of the contemporary world. There is compelling evidence for this shift in tide. In the most developed nations, women now outperform men at every educational level. In the US, they represent approximately 60% of university graduates and about 60% of master's degree holders. Even in traditionally male-dominated fields like law and medicine, women now make up half or more of new professionals. In many advanced economies, young urban women already earn more than their male counterparts. Companies with greater gender diversity in leadership positions consistently show better financial performance. Countries with more women in political leadership tend to invest more in health, education, and social welfare areas that build long-term human capital. These are not isolated phenomena, but part of an emerging pattern that transcends cultures and contexts. But what exactly are these adaptive skills that the new environment rewards? First, there's a neurological advantage that's rarely discussed. Neuroimaging studies reveal that women, on average, have greater gray matter volume in regions associated with language processing and higher connectivity between the brain's hemispheres. This may contribute to greater verbal fluency and the ability to integrate analytical and intuitive thinking, crucial skills in the knowledge economy. Second, women typically demonstrate greater acuity in the so-called theory of mind, the ability to perceive others' mental and emotional states, anticipating their reactions and needs. In a world where almost all high-value work is fundamentally collaborative, this advantage has profound implications for leadership effectiveness, team building, and complex negotiation. Third, women generally exhibit greater tolerance for ambiguous and persistent stress. While men often respond better to acute short-term crises that demand decisive action, women frequently demonstrate greater resilience in the face of chronic stressors that cannot simply be defeated, but must be continuously managed. In an era of constant change and growing complexity, this ability to thrive in ambiguity becomes incredibly valuable. Fourth, observe communication patterns. Linguistic studies show that women tend to use more inclusive communication styles, asking more questions, acknowledging others' contributions, and building on shared ideas. This model of communication often leads to better decisions in complex scenarios where no single individual possesses all the relevant information or perspectives. Can you see the emerging pattern? The new environment will increasingly reward these capabilities, not because some central authority decided to value feminine qualities, but because these skills simply produce better results in the world we're building. This transformation, however, is neither universal nor irreversible. It manifests most strongly in societies with greater legal equality and access to education, where artificial social pressures against female participation have been at least partially removed. In contexts where structural barriers still prevent women from developing and applying their capacities, this adaptive advantage remains largely potential rather than kinetic. And here we encounter one of the great paradoxes of our time. Precisely when technological and economic conditions are creating an environment that naturally favors characteristics more common in women, we see in many parts of the world a resurgence of reactionary forces determined to restore more traditional gender hierarchies. Why? The answer may lie in another evolutionary principle. The faster the environmental change, the stronger the selective pressure, and the more dramatic the disruption for organisms adapted to the previous environment. What we're witnessing may be understood as a defensive response to a transformation that threatens to render obsolete not only certain skill sets, but entire identities built around them. Yet from the broader perspective of evolutionary history, these reactions likely represent only small countercurrents within a much more powerful tide. The environment is changing in a fundamental direction, and systems that adapt to this new reality will thrive, while those that resist will eventually become marginal. It would be naive, however, to imagine that this transformation will occur without complex consequences. Every major evolutionary realignment creates not only winners, but also losers, those whose previous adaptations suddenly become disadvantages. If many men today feel disoriented in the modern world, it may be because certain qualities historically rewarded in masculine contexts, like competitive aggression and hierarchical dominance, now often function as liabilities rather than assets in many professional and social settings. The significantly higher male suicide rate across almost all societies, the decline in male participation in higher education, and the growing proportion of men who have withdrawn entirely from the workforce suggest an adaptation crisis that we need to acknowledge and address. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this future we're discussing most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about this too? I know that many times we keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming outdated or sexist in a world that celebrates every advance in gender equality without question. But your worries are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My biggest concern about this gender realignment is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective issues instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to build a future that benefits everyone. Because the real question is not whether men or women will dominate the future. The deeper question is how we can create a world where each person's talents are valued and developed regardless of gender. Perhaps the greatest challenge is overcoming the zero-sum mentality that often frames these discussions, as if the advancement of one group necessarily meant the diminishment of another. Historically, all successful major evolutionary transitions have involved not the simple replacement of one dominant group by another, but the emergence of new and more complex forms of symbiosis and complementarity. In fact, if we look at the evolutionary history of life on Earth, we see that the greatest leaps in complexity occurred not through pure competition, but through innovative cooperation. The very existence of eukaryotic cells, the basis of all complex organisms, resulted from the symbiotic fusion of different types of prokaryotic cells. Multicellular organisms emerged when individual cells learned to specialize and cooperate rather than compete. The evolution of sexual reproduction itself represented a revolutionary way of sharing genetic resources that were previously isolated in separate lineages. In each case, the apparent loss of individual autonomy led to extraordinary gains in collective capabilities. Likewise, the transformation we are witnessing now may not simply be about the ascendancy of one gender over another, but about the emergence of a new balance that integrates and amplifies the complementary strengths of different sets of adaptations. Men are not destined for evolutionary obsolescence. On the contrary, those who manage to develop the skills that the new environment values, often adaptations historically more common in women, will likely thrive extraordinarily. And women who can integrate some of the qualities traditionally cultivated in men, such as a willingness for calculated risk and strategic assertiveness, will find new frontiers of possibility. What we are glimpsing is not a simple inversion of gender dominance, but potentially its evolutionary transcendence. A more fluid and contextual balance where different constellations of qualities are valued in different contexts, unleashing a much greater human potential than our rigid binary systems ever allow. Of course, this vision may seem idealistic. Evolutionary transformations are rarely smooth or uniform, and this one will be no exception. There will be resistance, setbacks, and periods of intense turbulence as social, economic, and political systems adjust to the new reality. Different societies will navigate this transition at different paces and with varying outcomes. But the fundamental direction of selective pressure seems clear. The environment is changing in ways that favor a set of adaptations that have historically been more strongly selected in women. And while human societies can temporarily resist adaptive pressures through cultural structures, in the long term, systems that align with prevailing environmental realities tend to outperform those that ignore them. There are important practical implications for individuals, organizations, and societies in this understanding. For individuals, it suggests that investing in the development of emotional intelligence, empathy, collaborative communication, and systemic thinking will yield increasing returns, regardless of gender. For organizations, it indicates that genuinely promoting gender diversity, especially in leadership positions, is not merely a matter of social justice, but increasingly a competitive necessity. For societies, it suggests that policies facilitating the full participation of women in all spheres of public life are not luxuries, but strategic investments in adaptive capacity. For educators, it points to the importance of cultivating in all students, regardless of gender, the kind of social intelligence and cognitive flexibility that the future will demand. And for parents, it suggests the need to create environments that allow children to develop a full repertoire of human capabilities, free from the artificial constraints of traditional gender roles. On a deeper level, this transformation invites us to reconsider some of the fundamental narratives about what it means to be human. The idea that competition and dominance are the main drivers of evolutionary progress has deeply shaped our understanding of human nature and societies. But a broader view of evolution recognizes that cooperation, empathy, and social intelligence have been equally crucial to our success as a species. Our unique capacity to form complex networks of collaboration, to transmit cumulative knowledge across generations, and to coordinate action on unprecedented scales in the natural world has depended as much on our social capacities as on our ability for direct competition. What we are witnessing now can be understood as the next chapter of that evolutionary story, where the environment is selecting more strongly for qualities that enable even more sophisticated forms of human coordination and collaboration. And in this new chapter, adaptations that have often been undervalued precisely because they were associated with the feminine are being recognized for their true adaptive value. Allow me to offer a metaphor for this transformation. For millennia, we have imagined human evolution primarily as a linear journey of progress, where each new development represents a step forward on a single evolutionary ladder. In this model, different human groups might be on different rungs, but all are climbing the same ladder. This metaphor produced predictable hierarchies, with those displaying traditionally masculine qualities at the top. But what if the more accurate metaphor is not a ladder, but a complex, multidimensional field? In this view, different sets of adaptations represent explorations of different regions of this vast space of possibilities, each valuable in specific contexts, none inherently superior to the others. What we are witnessing today can be understood as a seismic shift in the topography of this field, altering which regions offer adaptive advantage. If the material conditions of human existence for millennia rewarded certain regions of this space associated with traditionally masculine adaptations, the emerging conditions are now rewarding different regions where adaptations more common in women confer advantage. This is not a question of moral superiority or intrinsic worth, but of ecological alignment with a changing environment. Note that I am not suggesting biological determinism here. Our brains and behaviors are extraordinarily plastic, shaped by both biology and culture, in complex interactions that defy simplistic nature versus nurture dichotomies. Plasticity is, in fact, one of our most powerful evolutionary adaptations, allowing us to respond flexibly to environmental changes without waiting for slow genetic shifts. What I am proposing is that we are witnessing the convergence of multiple forces, biological and cultural, that together are creating a new selective regime, one in which qualities that have historically been more cultivated and reinforced in women are becoming increasingly adaptive for all humans. It is important to recognize that this realignment is not occurring in a historical or political vacuum. It is happening in the context of centuries of systematic subordination of women, exclusion from spheres of power, and devaluation of their work and contributions. The growing appreciation of traditionally feminine qualities does not erase that legacy of injustice, nor does it automatically correct persistent power imbalances. In fact, we already see examples of how these newly valued qualities can be exploited, with women being burdened with unpaid emotional labor in professional environments, or having their contributions appropriated without proper recognition. Any authentically positive transformation will require not only the re-evaluation of these qualities, but also the reconstruction of systems and institutions in ways that more equitably distribute both power and responsibility. But perhaps the deepest insight that emerges from this analysis concerns the very nature of evolutionary adaptation. Traditionally, we have imagined adaptation as meaning fitness to a specific environment. But in a world characterized by accelerated change and increasing complexity, the most valuable adaptation may be the meta-capacity to continually adapt to new environments, a kind of second-order flexibility. And here again, we find an intriguing alignment with qualities that have historically been more cultivated in women. The ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to adapt behavior to different social contexts, to integrate contradictory information without resorting to premature simplification, to navigate ambiguity without insisting on artificial certainty, a constellation of capacities often more developed in those who have had to survive and thrive on the margins of power systems rather than at their centers. As we reflect on the implications of this ongoing transformation, it is worth considering how we can create a future that maximizes collective human potential rather than simply reversing historical patterns of dominance. How can we build educational systems that cultivate the full spectrum of human intelligences in all genders? How can we design workplaces that value and reward both assertiveness and empathy, both rigorous analysis and intuitive synthesis? How can we develop leadership models that integrate the best of masculine and feminine traditions into more adaptive and effective approaches? How can we create social structures that allow all people to flourish regardless of how their capacities align with traditional gender roles? These are not abstract questions. They are urgently practical ones for any society that wishes to thrive under the emerging conditions of the 21st century. And the answers we develop will profoundly shape the course of human evolution for generations to come. The history of evolution teaches us that periods of rapid environmental change often precede bursts of adaptive diversification as organisms explore new regions within the space of evolutionary possibilities. We are potentially on the threshold of such a period for our own species, one in which the possibilities for human flourishing may expand dramatically beyond the limits imposed by rigid gender systems and hierarchies built upon narrow forms of power. To navigate this transition successfully, we will need wisdom, courage, and above all, a willingness to question deeply rooted assumptions about which human qualities are most valuable and why. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't yet found the words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your longing for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not merely a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that so often leaves us disoriented and divided. What we are witnessing is not the end of human evolutionary history, but the beginning of a new and potentially extraordinary chapter, a chapter in which traits that have long been undervalued precisely because they were associated with the feminine finally receive the recognition they deserve for their adaptive value. A chapter in which we may begin to transcend limiting gender dichotomies in favor of a fuller appreciation of the spectrum of human capacities, a chapter in which we can co-create new forms of social, economic, and political organization that allow more people to flourish more fully. The future does not belong to men or women as essentialized categories, but to all who are able to develop the constellations of abilities demanded by the new environments we are creating. And if more women today seem positioned to thrive in this emerging future, it is not because of any inherent superiority, but because specific historical conditions have better prepared many of them for the demands of the world we are now building. The true triumph will come when all human beings can access and develop the entire spectrum of human capacities, freed from the arbitrary limitations of traditional gender roles. This is not a zero-sum game in which the advancement of one group necessarily comes at the expense of another. It is an opportunity to expand the circle of human possibilities for everyone. In this sense, the evolutionary secret is not that certain women are destined to dominate the future, but that the future belongs to those of any gender who can integrate and express the full range of human capacities that our long evolutionary journey has granted us. In that future, we may finally begin to appreciate how different sets of adaptations do not represent a hierarchy of value, but a mosaic of potentialities, each vital to our collective survival and flourishing in a world of growing complexity and change.
Darwin is the kind of prophet of sexual liberation. If I think about the liberation of gay people, of LGBTQ people, then if you dig underneath, you eventually find Darwin. For centuries upon centuries, gay people were persecuted and oppressed because of this mythological idea about sex, that sex was created by God for the purpose of procreation. And if you use sex for anything else, you're sinning against the purpose of the thing, so you must be punished. And then Darwin came, and Darwin said, in biology, there are no purposes. Nothing has any purpose in biology. In biology, there are only causes.
The thing is that this is just, extremely primitive AIs. The algorithms, the AIs that manage the social media platforms, they are just the first generation. We haven't seen anything yet. In 10 or 20 years, we will have far more powerful AIs, and we need to start thinking very seriously, how do we manage that? Again, understanding that these are not tools in our hands, these are agents that can make decisions that we can't anticipate, that can invent new ideas from new texts to new financial devices that really go beyond the human imagination. AI can replicate intimacy the same way that it masters language and the same way that it previously mastered attention. The next frontier is intimacy. And intimacy is much more powerful than attention. If you want to change somebody's views on politics, to sell a product, anything, intimacy is the most powerful tool to do that. Good friend can change your views in a way that no number of articles in a newspaper or a book can do. Until today, nothing could fake intimacy, and it was impossible in particular to mass produce intimacy. AI can do that. Now, what happens if a new generation grows up and develops intimate relations with AIs instead of with other human beings? Again, we don't know. It could have some maybe benefits, but the potential danger is enormous. That people will become attached to fake people, and in the process we lose the ability to create intimacy with real human beings, because real human beings are much more problematic than AIs. AI that wants to become your intimate friend, its greatest advantage is that it has no feelings of its own. It's never upset, it's never angry, it's never tired. It can focus on you 100% and understand exactly how you feel, create fake sense of intimacy. You try to establish a relationship with a human being, the feelings come in between.